In part 2 of our series, we showed how many modern Earth scientists have become much more comfortable in accepting the idea of catastrophic geological events having shaped Earth's past, to the point where some have abandoned and even mocked the older uniformitarian, slow and steady geological model in favor of neo-catastrophism. The reasons for them doing so are because of the obvious observational evidence that contradicts it, such as the idea of a 30-foot tall tree extending through what would be considered millions of years of sedimentary deposition, according to the old Lyellian model. It's just so obvious that a dead tree wouldn't survive hundreds of thousands of years of slow deposition and then fossilization that one geologist, Derek Ager, referred to it as ridiculous. So, Christians who formally adopted what was considered established science as the reason to reinterpret portions of Scripture, particularly Genesis, as plainly written, face a bit of a dilemma now. They now need to decide whether to abandon that older specific interpretation of facts in favor of the new one, or perhaps abandon the whole notion of allowing secular interpretations in science having the authority to interpret Scripture whatsoever. Well, for those who decide to commit to neo-catastrophism to any extent, they should understand there's a huge challenge to this new way of interpreting Earth's age based on the sedimentary rock layers as well. And Derek Ager's quote, mentioned in part 2, contains an important clue regarding it, so let me repeat it. We cannot escape the conclusion that sedimentation was at times very rapid indeed, and at other times there were long breaks in sedimentation, though it looks both uniform and continuous. Notice that he says he believes there was rapid sedimentation, interspersed by long ages, but that the layers themselves look both uniform and continuous, which means the layers appear to have been laid down one after another in a smooth, continuous fashion. And yet, because of his commitment to old Earth beliefs, he must believe there were vast breaks of time in between them, regardless. And that's a huge problem, because we see that the surface of the Earth is constantly changing due to erosion, with drastic changes sometimes occurring within our own lifetimes. Erosion is relentlessly taking place as rain, wind, and other factors are constantly at work on the topography of the Earth. However, erosion doesn't occur consistently and uniformly. Different hardnesses of soil and rock, varying weather patterns, and other factors can contribute to more or less erosion occurring at different rates in different locations. If millions of years of time had occurred between major sections of strata, then there should be ample evidence of it, showing uneven, more jagged contact points. And yet, as Ager admits, most of the rock layers we observe look uniform and continuous. Think of it like a stack of pancakes of varying thicknesses being gradually placed on a plate in a location a bunch of rats were able to nibble away the tops of each one before the next one was placed on top of it. If the rats, erosion, had chewed the top of each pancake, the rock layers, to various uneven depths, then a soft, warm, new pancake was placed on top and filled in the gaps in the one underneath, and you kept doing so with more and more pancakes, what would you see if you were to cut the stack of pancakes in half and look at the layers revealed? What you'd observe would be called a disconformity in geologic terms. You'd see jagged, wavy edges filled in one on top of another, not straight lines on top of one another like a normal stack of pancakes. But that's not what we consistently observe in the rock layers. The Grand Canyon is an excellent example of layers laid bare, where we can see a vast amount of sedimentary rock, cut in half so to speak, and representing a huge portion of the geologic column, some evolutionists suggesting it's up to 40% of the total. And what does it reveal? Does it look more like an old stack of pancakes roughed up by rodents, or a nice neat stack of hotcakes from Denny's? Well, obviously it's uniform and continuous overall, with a great example being seen at the contact point of the Coconino Sandstone with the Hermit Shale along the Bright Angel Trail. The line between them looks like it was drawn with a ruler, and yet there's supposed to be 10 million years of time that took place in between where the new layer was laid down, which means there was plenty of time for erosion to have caused a massive disconformity. And yet, it isn't there. This indicates what Ager refers to, a smooth, continuous deposition. So the contact should be called a conformity because observationally it's indicative of layers being deposited with little time break in between. And yet, because of their commitment to a millions of years time frame, primarily established through Lyell's now often abandoned uniformitarian model, such contact points are usually referred to as paraconformities in secular geological literature. However, this is primarily because of their non-negotiable commitment to deep time, rather than because of what's being observed. Remember what Ager's statement concluded? Reread it again for yourself. We cannot escape the conclusion that sedimentation was at times very rapid indeed, and at other times there were long breaks in sedimentation, though it looks both uniform and continuous. His basic summary is 1. We can't escape the conclusion that there was rapid, catastrophic deposits of sediments at times because of physical evidence. And yet, 2, even though it doesn't look like there was a vast amount of time between these deposition events because there's no significant disconformity in the rocks, i.e. no physical evidence, then 3, somehow we know millions of years of time passed in between them regardless. Now, while some might contend that there are examples in the geologic world that do show evidence of erosion in between various layers, all of those examples are quite easily explained in the biblical creationist diluvian model, the general model held to by geologists that adhere to the biblical account of Noah's flood being the cause of the majority of the sedimentary layers and the fossils therein. Many people have the idea that flood geology somehow proposes the Genesis flood was virtually instantaneous, covering the whole earth, stirring everything up, and dumping all of the sediments in one continuous event. However, according to Scripture, Noah's flood occurred for over a year. It took about 5 months before all the high mountains under the whole heaven, Genesis 7:19, were covered, and several more for the water to subside as the mountains rose up and the valleys sank down. Psalm 104, verse 8, at the end of the flood. So, both flood geologists and neocatastrophists believe there would have been episodic periods of massive, rapid deposition, and also periods of time in between where erosion events would occur in their respective geologic models. But flood geologists see the time for erosion to occur between layers as minutes or months, not millions of years, and that the layers may have been softer and not completely solidified in some cases. Whereas neocatastrophists would have to admit that the layers were completely solidified before the next event occurred in their model. The point being, the occasional non- or paraconformities sometimes observed in the geologic column are easily explained and consistent with what we'd expect to find if Noah's flood is true history. But the massive amount of smooth and continuous layers with almost no evidence of massive erosion we see all over the world are not consistent with the neocatastrophist view. This leaves us full circle to where we began. If uniformitarian geology, which overthrew flood geology, was based on a false interpretation of the rock layers because there's ample evidence of massive rapid deposition, and neocatastrophism, which replaced uniformitarianism because of its lack of explanatory power, cannot account for the uniform and continuous nature of the vast majority of the rock layers we observe, why not return to the model that can account for all of the observable evidence? Why won't scientists simply return to the Genesis account of Noah's flood and a corresponding literal 6-day creation as the better explanation? Likely because this whole controversy was never about the facts in science to begin with, but rather a worldview ideology which drove their conclusions rather than simply falling out of the facts, which is what we'll expose in part 4 of our series.